Metrix on the Mic, connecting the dots in life sciences.
Welcome to Metrix on the Mic, a podcast brought to you by Metrix, your partner in healthcare marketing and training solutions. On Metrix on the Mic, we'll be connecting the dots between scientific data, brand strategy, field execution, customer behavior, and patient outcomes. We'll bring you insights from industry thought leaders, share case studies of successful campaigns, and explore the latest trends in healthcare marketing and learning. So join us as we delve into the complex world of healthcare to help you deliver more with ease. I'm excited to share this conversation between myself and Nolan. I hope you enjoy. Hi, my name is Jessica Knox. I am the CEO of Metrix, and I am so excited to be joined by Nolan. We talk a lot together about a lot of topics, and we're going to do it with a recording in place today. So over to you, Nolan.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, and my name is Nolan Matthews, and I'm a learning strategist at Metrix. And today we're going to be talking about something that is very near and dear to my heart, getting to know your audience and the role of audience interviews in learning and development.
Absolutely. This has been a focus of many of our long conversations. When I think about getting to know your audience, I think about one of my favorite quotes. It was from somebody in communications at AT&T who said, "Designing a presentation without an audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern." And you could apply it to presentations. You can definitely also apply that to learning experiences, definitely to marketing as well. But at the same time, it's often skipped more so on the learning side than the marketing side. But even in marketing, sometimes we can get complacent. So where is the disconnect and what can we do about it? That's what we want to talk about today. And we will be focusing primarily on learning and development for the purposes of this discussion, but a lot of it is applicable in both disciplines. So Nolan, we're going to get started by talking about why we think that learning and development professionals are not analyzing their audience. What's getting in the way?
Yeah, I think it goes really far back. I think it's it's rooted in tradition and history, and I think it goes back to our education system. So most of our early experiences in learning and development is really in the education system. And if you think back to your early days in school, right, you as a student were not consulted, right, about what went into your curriculum. There was a series of topics that were decided, and then you as a student had to dutifully attend and go through the classes and topics that were decided long ago by other people. And so I think because that's so much of people's experience with learning, a lot of those approaches just become kind of entrenched and established in our corporate L&D practices, right? I think you think about any corporate training sessions, in person or virtual, they really resemble a lecture, right? There's someone up on stage with slides and everyone very quietly listening. Or our vast course libraries or our learning academies, things like that, content academies. I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of this language that we use also is rooted in concepts from education, right? Things like those course academies and those structures. So I think there's been sort of a pattern and a habit and a tradition established, right? That's very top down, right? The decisions about what people are learning were decided by someone else. And I think we sort of replicate that in our corporate L&D structure and the way that we carry things out.
For sure. You're really talking about traditions that are so entrenched, we probably adhere to them subconsciously. And I said it at the beginning too. I guess it's a related concept, but I suspect as well that sometimes people are a bit complacent too. We talk a lot about wanting to innovate in the learning function, but it's hard to do new things sometimes. And it's easier to just do it the same way that we've always done it, to your point, which is probably modeled after the educational system. And so I would argue too, there's probably a little bit of that it just feels like, and connected to that, just that learning and development professionals, like every other role and function, never seems to have enough time. We never seem to have enough time. Time is the biggest premium that we have at work right now. So I see those as connected as well. Anything else you think is getting in the way?
I think that's the sort of the main thing is just sort of a top-down tradition, and that approach I think is really the most fundamental and reason for sure.
For sure. And you do have to wonder too, it is a different mindset to really go deep with your audience. It's a different skill set. There could be some skill gaps as well, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so we think we know why people aren't doing it as much as they should. I know there's lots of people out there that do spend time with their audiences, but um, so the question is, why should we do it if people aren't doing it right now? What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a key thing to really argue if we're going to sort of have the position that knowing your audience is one of, if not the most critical things, right, to developing successful and effective learning and development. So I think one of the reasons connected to perhaps our corporate L&D structures being rooted in education history is that there's a lot about the education system that's actually pretty unpleasant, right? So when we think about what's one of the main motivators for paying close attention in class, it's the fear of a test, right? It's that sort of anxiety-based motivator that you might not be super interested in what you're learning, but you're going to be paying really close attention because of that looming test, right, you have to write. So I think that is a rather unpleasant outcome of that way of structuring things. And wouldn't it be better if we could have an approach that didn't sort of rely on anxiety-based motivators to get people to really pay attention? And I think another reason is that if we're following the structure of the education system, schools are really preparing people to write tests effectively, right? But for a lot of people for almost everyone on the job, right, I think their jobs look very different than writing tests, right? The things that we have to do on the job and the expectations are way different than in education. So you often hear stories of people say, like, I crammed before a test and then I forgot everything immediately after, right? It sort of suggests that this structure is good for people remembering things in the short term, but I'm not sure that it's really the best model to have people really applying their skills like what's needed on the job. I also think that there's a need to try something different. I think that there's a lot of evidence that corporate L&D isn't as effective as it could be in maybe its current iteration. We see some stats about voluntary usage of courses on LMSs, right? They're pretty low generally. And in Keith Keating's most recent book, The Trusted Learning Advisor, he writes about how globally 66% of people aren't currently really engaged in their work. All these signs are suggesting that there's an opportunity to do something different when it comes to L&D. I think one of those options could be really flipping the focus and really taking a closer look at the audience.
Absolutely. Yes, I get very dismayed when I see stats like that. I saw something recently, 12% of people or 12% of sustainment really happens on the job after you've gone to a course, which is pretty similar to what we've seen around memory. Again, it's not all about memorization, as we know, it's about skills, but yeah, it's pretty disheartening when we think, okay, so what are we doing then to really do things differently? I think you had a few examples too of just thinking about how a manager would approach performance and maybe making a parallel. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have to credit Nick Shackleton-Jones with this, who is, among other things, the author of the book How People Learn, which has really shaped a lot of my thinking on this topic. And I actually put this question to him, and I said, how would you respond to someone working in L&D who would say, I don't think it's necessary that you need to talk to your audience in order to design training because they don't know what they don't know. You should spend your time talking to the experts, right, who really know those topics. Why do you need to talk to the audience? So I sort of put that to him. And he gave me this great kind of example, which he turned to me and he said, well, why do you come to work, right? Why do you care about the things that you care about at work? And, I listed off a few things that I'm passionate about and care about at work. And he said, okay, what would a really great manager do if they knew those things about you, right? If that manager really knew what you cared about. And I said, well, I guess they would find more opportunities for me to explore those areas, grow in those areas, build on that motivation. And that was the answer. He was like, exactly. That's why it's really important to know your people really well and know the audiences that you're training for really well, because it just feels really intuitive, right? That's a nice and motivating kind of way to grow. And it feels like that's the way that a really supportive manager would work with you to grow your skills. So I really think there is that sort of intuitive sense too, that it feels like the right thing to do. And it feels true to our experiences on the job, where a lot of times the way that we grow is there's a new challenge that we want to take on, and we're really focused on pursuing that new area that we want to get better at or try something new.
Mm-hmm. On a total aside, I think, first of all, that makes a lot of sense. But on an aside, you mentioned earlier that when you're working with, say, a business stakeholder, or you're working with, in our case, a client, and they say, oh, well, we don't need to talk to anybody. We know what we need. How often do you see that happening in your work?
Every time, almost every time, right? Because I think a lot of L&D corporate functions are relatively new to them. Also, something that you mentioned earlier, right? There might not be a clear skill set for how to do audience interviews and how to involve your audience in the approach. So it happens all the time. And I think it's totally understandable. It's totally natural. Right? I think you could have someone express that and think, well, the education system, right? I wasn't consulted about the topics that I learned and I still made it through. It still exists the way that it does. Yeah, it happens a lot. And I think in order to deviate from that approach, that sort of top-down education-based approach, we as L&D professionals really need to have a strong point of view and a clear process for how and why we involve our audience in the design of learning material.
So any other reasons why you think we should be looking at audience?
Yeah, there's another thing too, which is kind of about effectiveness overall. Right? Again, this is coming from the great work and writing of Nick Shackleton-Jones, who in his book, How People Learn, put forward a theory of learning that's based on this idea of the affective context model. And basically it describes that we don't have a great understanding of how information is actually stored in the brain, right? We sort of think of our brains as almost like computers where information can go in, and then when we need to pull that information, we just, almost like searching through an index, we can find that information that we need, and it's sort of how we bring that information back up. But Nick in his book puts forward a description that's different, and really it's all based on emotion, that we don't actually remember facts and details and information. We code our memories through emotion, and we use those emotions to then reconstruct our memories. So what that kind of leads you to is that ultimately you'll only remember things that leave an emotional impact. So if you want something to stick in someone's memory, you have to have that emotional impact, really. And that memory is really an essential part of learning. We're only going to remember the things that matter to us, right, according to this kind of argument. And so knowing what matters to someone is a really deeply personal thing. And so if we want to have our learning really stick, it would sort of suggest that we need to know what matters to people so that we can communicate in such a way that it's going to leave that sort of personal and emotional impression on people, that will then sort of form the basis of memory and then ultimately lead to learning. So I think if we think about things in that way, it sort of suggests that if we talk about things that don't matter to people, it's not going to form a memory, which I think also feels like kind of intuitive. So,
And that same argument can also be used around time, right? Because we have done many an analysis, and I think across the board, the number one challenge or barrier to learning every time pretty much is time, which is, oh, I don't have enough time to learn, which I think, first of all, is fair. That's structural. There's definitely bigger things at play than just, oh, they're not motivated enough to learn, because in some cases there are real limits on capacity that exist in our workplaces. But at the same time, we know that people do make more time for things that they really care about, right? So the more we can connect to those, the more we can perhaps start to overcome some of those time challenges, which we see very regularly. So now we're going to talk about the business side of things, because and you and I have had many discussions about this. I think as you passionately talk about the audience, which I definitely see, I'm always saying, wait, the business, we have to stay really focused on that too. In a lot of cases, people don't necessarily want to change their behavior. They don't necessarily know what the future state of the organization looks like. They may not have full visibility into business plans and priorities. So what would you say about how to approach focusing and really understanding your target audience versus understanding the business and the business priorities and needs?
Yeah, this is the true challenge, and I think the true art of how you would work with audience analysis and how you'd sort of find that middle ground. I think that there's probably a slight shift in priority that a focus on the audience might suggest, which is that as critical as those business outcomes and objectives are, it's possible that it's just going to be necessary that there is a slight shift towards just what individuals are sort of motivated by. Not entirely, certainly, but I think finding a balance between the two would probably be the ideal state. So I guess a dream situation that I could imagine is an L&D function that really understands what matters to the organization. So they spent really done a lot of work to understand these are the key business drivers. These are the key tasks and outcomes that different audience groups need to do in order to achieve those outcomes. So they're really clear on the performance that's needed. On the other hand, the L&D function can get to know their people really well, their audiences really well, and they could know everything that individuals are motivated by and passionate about. And then the L&D function could play a really specific role in matching up those things, right? So that to say, hey, the organization has a need for this, you're passionate about this thing that's very similar, let's provide an opportunity for you to grow in that direction. And I think that sort of shows a way to try to combine those two and find opportunities for an individual to grow in a direction that's also really valuable and useful for the organization.
Totally. And I think to me too, it's beyond just about what motivates people, right? It's also, and we have some great examples I think we want to share. We were talking about sharing, but it's also this idea of, okay, this is what the business wants you to do. There could be some very real or clear objections from the target audience, well, you want me to do this, but I feel this, or I know this, or this is a challenge for me to get there. And how will you know to address any of those things without talking to the audience as well? So I think that to me is also a clear reason, right? You might not always get that perfect alignment of motivation and organizational goals, right? But you can at least try to reduce the friction when it comes to organizational goals or the business side of things. I often go on a soapbox about this, that training to me is also a way, learning design is a way of, it's about implementing strategy, right? And it's where the rubber meets the road. And it's only once you work through, well, how will people actually do this, that you start to surface maybe sometimes some more fundamental issues with the strategy or gaps or things that they didn't anticipate in terms of implementing it. So I think it's really, again, that important bridge to really understand what will it really take to change behavior at an organization.
Right. Yeah, I think that point about friction is really interesting. And it's sort of something that I've been thinking about, because a lot of times what I've learned and seen through audience analysis is there'll be a business priority, and we'll talk to the audience about that business priority. We'll sort of say, well, what do you think about this opportunity? Or, where are you sort of currently at? And a lot of times they'll be focused on something pretty different, right? There'll be a big change that's going on or something like that, or a drive for a new way of working, but they've still got very day-to-day concerns. And so they don't even really have that on their radar. It's not a priority. It's a real challenge. And so I wonder, could, by addressing more of those day-to-day concerns and challenges and those points of friction, could that then allow the audience to be more open to those bigger initiatives that are going on? And I think that you're right. And then also in the implementation of those big initiatives, right, there's going to be things you didn't think about that are going to be challenges for the audience. Yeah.
Absolutely. So now I want to talk a little bit about some examples in practice. So I think almost every time we do a really good audience analysis, we are surprised. There are always things. They may not be huge, life-altering discoveries, but there's usually things that are fairly substantial that change the way that we approach design. So Nolan, what are some of those examples that stand out in your mind?
Yeah, they're usually pretty simple or almost sort of mundane things, but they're very, very specific. So one that comes to mind recently is working on a project with a global software company on some compliance training. And one of the big objectives or goals of the compliance training was getting people to spot examples of potential fraud or bribery or sort of things like that. And the compliance team that we were working with was really adamant about that as sort of being a priority, and they weren't sure why it didn't seem to be something that people were super passionate about. And so speaking to one of the audience members for this global software company, I learned, as he was sort of sharing, he was like responsible for working in kind of partnerships, so approving the people who could work as partners with this global software company. And shared, yeah, I'm really passionate about making sure that my colleagues are working with standing partners, right, that are going to follow our policies and procedures and they're going to be ethical and all that stuff. He's like, I'd hate to think that I would approve someone who then have a negative experience for someone else. And he was like, yeah, we're supposed to do this anti-bribery and corruption and fraud questionnaire, but he's like, it seems so silly that you could just lie on the form. You could just mark off all these boxes. And then what does that do to actually stop someone from acting in a way that is unethical? And I sort of brought that back to our compliance stakeholders. And I said, hey, this is the feeling of your audience members. They just don't see the purpose of this checklist, and they'd be open to doing it. But this is sort of their perspective on it. They just don't see how it's helpful. And so by working with those compliance stakeholders, we were able to sort of reframe the request to have it more reflect the priorities and concerns of that individual. So knowing that they care about making sure that people are working with the right kind of partner, we could reframe that request to use that checklist to say, by having a partner check those things off, that is a commitment to act in this way, right? And it makes it easier for us to then sever that relationship if we need to, if they violate any of those things. So we're able to then position that request to say, hey, use this checklist to sort of say, this is a very powerful tool to helping us make sure that we're only partnering with people that are applying with those things. So I think that's also the dream of balancing the audience concerns and perspective with what matters to the organization. It's almost like a way to reframe how you communicate the purpose of doing those things. And I think that's also another really powerful reason to use audience analysis, is it helps you sort of communicate the purpose of things from a more user focused perspective.
Absolutely. Another big one for us is what we've been doing more and more with our clients lately is user experience work and user experience consulting, because often too we'll work with clients that have huge amounts of training and learning assets and experiences available to their employees, and there may be pieces in particular they say these are really important, and then we talk to the target audiences and they say things like, well, I don't know where to find anything, that I don't know where to go, where to find anything. Oh, I don't know that this piece even exists. So you sent it to me once and it was a big deal for you, but I've forgotten about it. So really even just the navigation. I think that a lot of learning departments take that for granted, that people just automatically know where to go and find everything. And that's a huge pain point. And sometimes too, by talking to the audience, you can say, okay, well, where are you going most frequently? How can we bring more, into the flow of work? But how can we connect you or make it easier to find what you're looking for? It can also be a big help for sure. Any last example before we move on from you, Nolan?
Yeah, I think one of the other really interesting examples, speaking to that sort of user experience and organization side of things, was a national client that I was working with, and we were looking at a program for the most senior sales executives at this organization. And they had just an absolute mountain of material and content. It was actually a 3-year curriculum, basically, of hundreds and hundreds of individual learning objects. We're talking learning modules, videos, documents. It was just staggering, the amount of things. And naturally, the client had heard a lot of feedback that it was very difficult to navigate and it was really overwhelming. So when we spoke to the audience about their experience trying to navigate through all of that stuff, right, they said things like, well, it's organized in a way that suggests there's always this one process that we go through in sales But that's really not the case, right? Depending on where we're coming into a sales process or depending on the client, we're not starting in this really linear way that the learning team has organized all this material. Instead, we just have a bunch of tasks that we're trying to do. We're trying to do things like create an account plan, prepare for meetings and things like that. They don't think of it in the same way that this learning team had spent a really long time planning it out. So we completely reorganized that mountain of content to more reflect the key tasks that the sales team told us they had to do. So rather than having it sort of this like learner journey that was planned out, we more just focused on, okay, well, what are the things that you need to do? And then people can navigate things in sort of a less defined order, but more based on things they're trying to achieve. And also in that conversation, we learned really interestingly that these account executives all shared this sort of shared experience of around 5-6 months in being completely stressed out about having to complete their account plans. It's like, okay, well, tell me a bit more about that stress. And they were like, yeah, we didn't know what the expectations were because there were no examples provided to us. It felt like we were all creating them from scratch, right? And so that allowed us to come back and provide a recommendation to say, hey, a library of examples is exactly what our audience needs to help them understand what the expectations are. So it helped both improve the experience in terms of navigation as well as kind of uncover a need and a challenge that we could address in a way that you might not immediately think of when it comes to L&D, right? It wasn't an e-learning module. It wasn't more documentation. It was just a library of examples. So
I am a huge advocate for examples of what good looks like. Absolutely. That is something that I think that we do not do enough of. Sometimes it feels like there aren't good examples, but then that's a problem because if the organization can't come up with a good example, but they're expecting that of their workforce, there's a gap, right? So yeah, definitely see that. Another one I see sometimes is, well, I don't really see what you're asking me to do as part of my job. So that can be something that can come up, okay, well, you're asking me this, but this actually has no connection to what I do day to day, or this isn't really my concern. So I see that one as a common thing we unearth when we talk to target audiences. So, okay, so we've talked about the why people don't. We've talked about the why people should. We've talked about what it can look like when you do it and some of the things you can unearth. So the last question we want to talk about is how. How do we do it? And Nolan, how do you like to approach audience analysis?
Yeah, my favorite way is just good old-fashioned one-on-one interview or small focus group of just getting a lot of time to talk to the audience. And going back to Nick Shackleton-Jones's work in How People Learn, he has this process he describes called an emotional curve, where basically your question to your audience is just, hey, describe to me for a certain time period. Most often it's within the last year. Just tell me about your experience in role. Tell me about the highs, the lows, the major milestones associated with those things. And that will really help you build an understanding of what that individual's experience is like in their role over the course of a year. And also to sort of know what their main tasks are, what they're spending their time worrying about, their challenges, things like that. And so it's a really just open-ended question like that to say, hey, tell me about your experience. Let's kind of plot out the major milestones, major moments of emotional significance, because we know that emotion is tied to memory. And then really the skill becomes of digging in deeper and asking follow-up questions when people share something, when they say, oh, I really liked that. Hey, tell me about what it was that you liked about that. Or, oh, I was really overwhelmed by this. I didn't know what to do. Okay, what were your questions? What was unclear? What were you overwhelmed by? And I think that is my favorite method, is just spending a lot of time interviewing and talking to people about their experiences. That's the most useful one that I've found.
Absolutely. You can go really deep. Although, and we have discussed this before, is that when you do an interview, the risk is, especially if you're only doing a few, that you then bias your findings to those few individuals. What if there's quite a vast range of experiences, of challenges, of feelings? So what then? And I like to suggest as well to balance it with surveys so that you can get a broader swath of experiences. Obviously, you can't go nearly as deep in a survey and you can't do follow-up questions, so there's limitations. But what are your thoughts there? How do you address that?
Yeah, that's certainly tricky, and yeah, you certainly want to be aware of any sort of potential biases. But I think it's important to have a good sort of representative sample. So early on in a project, right, making sure that you've segmented your audience appropriately so that you are talking to people sort of representative of each distinct group that you're looking to support. And then within that group, you need to make sure as well that you have enough people that you've actually spoken to. So for most projects, I think probably 10 to 15 people from a segment is a good number. And then you start to sort of see, that gives you enough context, I think, to be able to see, well, what is unique to that individual's experience? And then what is generally true for people in that role? So I think as you sort of hear insight into their experience, I think it's important to sort of filter those two things out, right? Like what are some things that might be true generally for people in that role at that organization? And what are things that might be true for that specific individual? And things that are specific to that individual, that might not be something that you can really tackle in L&D. That might be more a manager relationship to help that person work through that. But yeah, I think when you have maybe 10 to 15 people, it gives you enough perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also a big fan of direct observation as well. So shadowing, going in and shadowing people, going on, if you're in pharma, going on ride-alongs with reps as an example, because there's a lot of maybe tacit things that maybe people aren't able to say because it's just so implied. You just take it for granted that it's an important piece to share with you. So I'm a big fan whenever you can do that as well. You really get a whole different sort of context and feel for the audiences you're designing for. Behavioral data too. That is something as well that I think is hugely untapped. For instance, if you're looking at managers, can you look at performance management data? Can you look at obviously coaching reports if they have them, things like that? So what does the data say about their behaviors versus, and it won't tell you obviously their motivations or their needs or what's on their mind or their feelings, but it's a nice complement as well. And then as well, market research. And this is something that also, we talked about bringing the outside in as well. There are sources like the LinkedIn Learning Report that I think it was a couple of years ago said that career development was the #1 motivator for learning and development for people. So also taking that lens and saying, okay, what's out there? Because those are generalizations, but could be some useful data. I also am a big proponent. I think a lot of this really touches on concepts of human-centered design, right? Which is the whole idea of human-centered design is involving end users in the design process. And, a great example of this is when they started making toothbrushes for children, they thought, okay, well, children, we're making toothbrushes. We just need to shrink the toothbrush down to child size, and that'll be perfect for them. But when they actually watched children try to use the toothbrushes, they realized their hands were less developed and they needed a thicker handle, right? So there's all sorts of things that you can learn from design when you really spend time with your audience, right? And so it's this whole idea that great design is really based on deep understanding of the audience and often involving them in the design process along the way. And that has a whole toolkit associated with it. I think a lot of the same tools we just talked about, so observation, interviews, focus groups, there's a whole field around how to really deeply understand your audience that's worth checking out. Last question. So one of the things that we do when we have an audience analysis sometimes is we create personas to help us as design tools, right? To say, okay, here's a snapshot of somebody representative of one of your segments, and here are their concerns, here are their challenges, their needs, just to keep as documentation to keep that perspective front and center in the design process. We now have the world of generative AI, where and that can be a great source of initial understanding of an audience, right? Of going in and saying, okay, you can ask it. It seems to do a pretty good job of that. Curious to know though, when it comes to just skipping the whole audience analysis and just saying, hey, AI, write me a persona for this profile at this type of company, and what might they think if we're trying to achieve XYZ. Sometimes I would say you get some pretty decent starting places. What are your thoughts, Nolan?
Yeah, it's certainly something that I've tried out, and I think there are some really great tools. As you mentioned, I think Skills GPT being one of them to really get a focused understanding of tasks that someone might be doing in a particular role. But maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned in this way, but I do think there really is just no replacement for that time spent talking to someone. And my thinking for that is my experience using AI-generated profiles. Like I think they are a good starting point to give you like the beginning of a sense of what it might be like for someone to do their job. I just think that the things that come up in the interviews with audiences are so specific and weird sometimes that you just would never necessarily expect them. And I think it's just the specificity of the detail. So for that account executive example I was mentioning before, that their biggest challenge was that they didn't have examples of account plans. It's the kind of specificity that's true likely just for that organization and just for that particular role. I think it's that level of detail, right? Or their specific experience interacting with their learning materials and the way that they were organized, right? I think it's like so true, so specific to just that role in that organization, that because you want to have really specific solutions to really specific problems, I think that's where there just is no replacement getting to that level. But I agree. I think that it's a useful starting point for sure. So that maybe you can ask slightly more targeted questions, but
yeah. I can actually, even though I was playing a little bit of a devil's advocate, I guess you could say, I think that there's pros and cons, right? I would almost recommend that if you can't do an audience analysis, if you have tried to get the go ahead to do it and you have given it everything you got to try to persuade people to have you do it, and that you still can't do it, I would do that over nothing.
for sure.
But also there is that risk too that I go back to. I think, yeah, you're right, getting a good understanding of the role, but maybe not about what's really on people's minds, because there's also a lot of bias built into AI, right? And the greatest designers, I think if you're thinking about human-centered design, the greatest designers go in with no preconceptions because they really want the audience to drive their thinking. So I think that's where I've landed as we're talking it out.
I think that's such a good point, right? Is that the whole purpose of audience analysis, sometimes called discovery, right? Is you want to discover new things, right? You don't want your conclusions to be drawn from any assumptions or biases or preconceived notions, right? Which is a lot of what generative AI it's predicting, right? It's predicting what would make sense in that particular context. And I think what we want to discover is the unpredictable, you know? So yeah, I think even though it's sort of referred to as generative AI, I think what we want in our discovery ideally is that it's a very generative process where you're prepared for the unexpected, or you're hearing things that are unexpected and new, ideally. So
ideally. Great. Well, we are going to end it there. Nolan, thank you for coming along with me on this journey today, and I will see you next time.
thanks so much.